Hey, everyone, and welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, talk about the art and the science of the things that we're putting on our feet. Today, I am super pumped to have Jen and Evan from Brooks back on the podcast. We had a great time last time, and it is on me for not getting you two on here sooner. And I'm super happy that we could find some time to talk and get to know what you both are up to and some of the new developments that not only are happening at Brooks, but I think can really educate consumers and the rest of us on what is progressing in the footwear industry and what we need to be thinking about, especially when it comes to things like the everyday runner, habitual motion pathways, which we talk about all the time, and other things about how we are measuring things. But before we dive into that, since it's been a minute, would you two mind reintroducing yourselves and helping us understand your roles at Brooks?
Yeah, of course. My name's Jennifer Sumner. I'm the director of run research at Brooks. I've been with Brooks a little over 7 years now. Started as an individual contributor, a researcher in the lab, and have seen the big growth of our team and the brand over the last 7 years. I think when I started, there was 4 of us, and now there's like 27. So it was quite a lot of growth in that time. A little bit of my background, just for people's awareness, if you're listening to. I got into the running world, I say, through consulting. I was a technician for Ben O'Nig with his consulting company out of Canada. And I moved after my master's degree and didn't know what I wanted to do. And he was hiring a technician. And I was like, yeah, let's try that. And ended up getting it. It was great. And I got a lot of exposure to performance product. He does everything from run to hockey skates and all of it. Decided to do my PhD with him. So I was with him for another 4 years after 3 years of being a technician with him. And then joined the industry directly, worked at New Balance for a short stint before my time here at Brooks.
Sweet. Evan?
Yep. Evan Day. I'm a manager here on the run research team at Brooks. I've been here 4.5 years total now. First 2.5 years as an individual contributor, and the last 2 years in kind of a manager position. And then kind of within probably the past half year or so, I'm kind of positioned to overseeing what we call like dynamic cushioning. The joke I kind of tell people when they ask what dynamic is it's shoes without the intent of running really fast in. So kind of your core trainers, think of like the Ghost, Glycerin, Glycerin Max, Ghost Max, Beast, all of those standard cushion shoes, kind of overseeing what we call performance or biomechanics research, and then also perception research in that area as well. Background for me, I've been a runner since I fell in love with it in middle school, and always fascinated by footwear and injuries and everything of that sort. And yeah, found biomechanics in undergrad when, you see a flyer to make $10 to go run in a lab in the basement of a building somewhere, and absolutely fell in love with it from that point on when I found out you could have a career asking questions about running. And went through grad school, did master's at Iowa State, and then did my PhD at the University of Oregon with Mike Hahn, very running performance focused there. Short stint at Adidas doing basketball footwear, actually, and then found my way up to Brooks right in early 2020.
So just for the listeners and viewers, you have 2 PhDs here, one from University of Calgary and one from University of Oregon. There's a huge volume of experience and knowledge here and pedigree. So I'm super pumped. And these two are also super cool as well. So I'm really happy to pick their brains and get to have a conversation with them, and hope that you can come along for the ride and really enjoy this. So I think one of the things that was mentioned first, and we've actually talked about this, and this is actually what we talked about coming and doing this podcast on, was the development and design of footwear for the everyday runner. Part of the reason we brought this up is when you two put up with me when I showed up there at Brooks. I'm just kidding, not put up with, but you were awesome. And we got to geek out together in the amazing lab that you have. Some of the questions that came up, I was the classic runner asking about all the super shoes, stuff like that. And then over the last couple of years, what I've come to realize is despite the popularity of these shoes, that is still not what the everyday runner is often choosing or actually needs. And so what I'm hoping a little bit of this, so we can get into like, what does the recreational runner really need to think about in terms of choosing footwear, with a bit of insight into how that is designed and what things to maybe think about beyond just plates, maximal stack heights, things like that, with additions of going, we all move different ways. How do we figure out what shoe is best for us? So is there any place that you want to start?
So much good stuff.
Yeah.
Would you want to kick it off,
I'll let
Evan?
Jen start that one. I'll let you start and I'll riff off you. How about that?
Okay. Yes, man. So I'm very passionate about the everyday runner. I think as we talked about this last time a couple of years ago, just from a personal standpoint of how the run shows up for me, I was never more than a 5K distance. I think once I thought I would do a 5-mile race, and then I thought I might die because I just find the run is so much harder than I anticipated. I got into running when I was doing my PhD because I was studying novice runners and figured, well, I have to run if I'm going to study them because that would just be like silly. I won't understand anything. So that was like my entry point into it. And just a sense of like, once I was in, especially being in the industry, whether consulting or then really being in it, this verbiage that's attached to it, whether you're a runner or not, so I had felt like I worked at places where I couldn't even test the product because my run wasn't fast enough, long enough distance, anything else, even though I was running like 10 miles a week and I was like a 9.5-minute miler. That wasn't showing up as enough to like be considered as someone who can give feedback on shoes. And when I joined Brooks, I was just blown away of how inclusive it was. It was like, it really, like if the run showed up for you at all, that was really all that mattered, not how it was, how fast it was, just that it's there, and really feel passionate about that in terms of the brand. So that's really special to me about the whole brand. When you're developing the products themselves, so we test and how much volume that we have tested on shoes. One, like we have our pinnacle product that does go to the athlete, your Hyperion Elite. Those will be shoes that you test with the athlete, like specifically. You're not even probably bringing the everyday person in as heavily on those. But then the other 98% of everything we're building is for the general runner. And when we test those shoes, those go out to the general runner. We're not sending them to a pro athlete or high level caliper in that sense to evaluate it for us. So that volume, but also where we're learning from the everyday runner. So this is a partnership we'll have with Dash and their lived experience, but how you can hear from a runner right after they run something like a marathon, and you're asking them more about what types of product they were using, why they were using it, what did they train in versus what showed up for them on race day. And those ones I think are very intriguing, what you train in versus what you race in. And yes, by the time you hit a marathon, there's different calipers of what you're racing in. So Evan and I have talked about this before because Evan actually runs marathons, whereas I do not. So this is where I just more see it from a researcher perspective and what you hear. But when we ask people that are going to have a Brooks lean, because if you are signing up for a survey for us, then you at least know who Brooks are. So we'll have a bias in that in terms of who we're hearing from. But the most trained in are your Ghost and your Glycerin. That's what people are using. That is in our dynamic, pillar cushion. And then on race day, still, I'd say at least half are staying in a Ghost or an Adrenaline. Like they stay in that shoe. They train in it and they race in it in that space. And then the other half are switching to like the Hyperion Elite. They will go to that super shoe on the race day. And then you'll see the parts that get interesting for me with that too are the aches and pains people will have. So the people that stay in the shoe that they trained in and keep it on race day, do report less aches and pains on the race day itself and the day after compared to people that switched. And so when I was seeing some of those, I was asking Evan switches shoes. And I'm like, would you ever not switch? And I feel like your answer was no, definitely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. I would, even if you told me I would not, I would have less aches. Like I'm switching on race day. So, it really boils down to like what someone's goals are, whether it's the PR in that race, the switching of the shoe is it, or if it's like, I just want my body to stay as intact as possible for as long as possible. And I can achieve that in maintaining my shoe without needing to go to the next level of a PR in a certain way. So just understanding that there is this massive range of why and how people are running to be able to meet everyone where they are and have the awareness of these different needs, I think is a big aspect of what Brooks researches. That was real rambly. I should have let Evan.
That was great.
You're on a podcaster.
Yeah, it was great. This is what we're all about. So this is awesome. Can I emphasize a piece that you mentioned that sticks out to me quite a bit right now?
Yeah.
So one of the things we talk about and we try to post about it is that, and not to be like exclusive speed stuff like that, is a lot of people will email us or ask us, hey, I've got this race in like 2-3 weeks. I can't figure out what super shoe to wear. I don't necessarily have a speed goal. I want to finish. And I think if you stay in the running, like you kind of stay in the running geekery world, or you kind of focus on like the more elite stuff, you tend to think that everybody wears a different shoe for race day. And that's not really true. In fact, there is still a large percentage. In fact, probably a greater percentage, I'm guessing, because you said about 50%, or is it a little bit more? They're still using the same shoe of the population.
Yeah, I'd have to pull it. So even from this survey now, we have about 500 runners that have done it. They continuously ask this question. So this will just pass over the years as we have it. And we looked at how many people stayed in the exact same shoe, how many people stayed at least within the same brand, and how many people straight up switched brands. So like if you maybe trained in a Ghost, but you switched to a Nike on race day or something. So like those were kind of the genres we broke them into. I think like at least 50 stayed in their own brand. So they might have still gone to the super shoe version. Like you went from a Ghost to a Hyperion Elite. But then I don't know the exact numbers from that now 500, because when I analyzed it, it was like 200, and we've amassed another 300 since then. But I would have guessed at least about a third were just staying in the shoe they trained in. Like they trained in a Ghost, they raced in a Ghost. And that was what their objective was in the end. And it was, again, if it was better for they had less aches and pains at the end of it, because their body's not adjusting to completely different mechanics of how the shoe's influencing you that day. But
so that makes sense to me, because that's something we can frequently emphasize, is like, don't try tons of new stuff before race day. Like if your goal is to finish, use the same shoe that you've been training in. And I think that a lot of the super shoes, as you mentioned, a lot of companies really tend to focus on their testing and development with faster speeds, faster runners. Doesn't mean that other people can't run in them. It just might mean, and maybe I'm biased from a PT's perspective and kind of thinking about return to run post-marathon or getting through it without any kind of injuries or things like that. And injury prediction is hard enough as it is, that encouraging people to go, you can stick with the same shoe for sure if that's something that you're comfortable with, because your goal in the marathon, if your goal is to finish, should be about comfort. And that's really awesome to hear. Yes, you actually have like less soreness and less tissue damage. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, self-reported aches and pains. Like
self-reported.
Everyone has aches and pains after a marathon, but the severity of that ache and pain reported is less with the folks that kept the same model of the same brand that they were trained in.
Got it. So that means like you should be, so big piece, I guess, is you should be training in the thing you plan to utilize. There shouldn't be a switch at the last time. And it is totally okay to use your training shoe as a marathon or as a race shoe, depending on what your needs are as an individual. And I feel like that is what gets lost with a lot of the hype and belief. And I'm not trying to put anybody down. I'm just trying to keep people, helping people find what's really best for them, which could vary. Is that a good way of interpreting what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's what I would. And those ones that we want to keep analyzing would have been like the folks that are signed up to share with us on that do share their watch metrics. So you can see their race day performance or see how that changed from any PRs they had from that sense, to see if there's any correlation also still with your performance on race day. But ultimately, if your number one goal is to reduce the damage on the body, then I would say like staying in your same shoe is probably your safer bet. It's not that it's impossible, obviously, but
the marathon is a lot on the body. I don't know if I'm sure you two have seen this research, that there's evidence that it takes at least 3 months to really truly recover musculoskeletal from a marathon. And most people will just jump in not too far after that. It's like, it's not that you shouldn't do it. You just have to know that when you run that far, that hard, there's a lot of tissue damage that you have to recover from. Make sure that for longevity purposes, again, biased, you need to think about what might help you best. And this is just more information for people to ponder.
Yeah.
Does not surprise me.
Evan walked pretty funny for a while at work after that he does.
Funny all the time.
I think, Evan, you and I we definitely need to go for one, because somebody was making a comment. You made a comment when we met, and you're like, I have just the weirdest running gait. And I have also been told, people have looked at me and go, how are you going forward? So I feel like we need to have like a running gait face-off who has the weirder biomechanics.
Deal. Absolute
Sweet.
Deal. The best part is I think our marathon PRs are right around the same also, so maybe we're onto something here.
We might be onto something. I don't know if I could do that currently right now. I'd like to do that again with a stroller, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So what does this look like from a biomechanics perspective? Just to give people a little bit more on the science of when you are developing footwear for elite versus the recreational runner, what kind of things are going, like big picture things are going through your heads?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can take kind of maybe more the recreational side of it. one thing we kind of like to lead with here from like a thought process is experience-led biomechanics. And that comes all the way up from our SVP, Carson. And so we're always thinking through, okay, experience first, and then either what are biomechanics metrics that can maybe create that experience or kind of lead to it, but then also what are just our tried and true. These have to show up every shoe. And so the show up every shoe biomechanics are our habitual motion path deviations. And I assume we'll tangent into that here at some point with the habitual motion path. But what that is really at a high level, individualized support, you could say. And so it's just making sure that a shoe is not making you run really differently than your body habitually or naturally wants to. And at least that our shoe is equal to or better than anything on the market. We'll never like put a shoe out that increases that difference. And so we study the habitual motion at the ankle and the knee. And then every shoe that we test will get that type of testing. And then an example of say like an experience metric would be like the Ghost Max. We were really looking at MTPJ dorsiflexion and reducing it in that shoe compared to a Ghost. Definitely part of that was a lot of like the sports med application of just people with different forefoot clinical problems such as metatarsalgia or bunions or things of that sort. We know reducing motion there can help. But we also know that that can help create like a rocker experience and kind of that rocker transition experience, which was also part of what we we're going for from that experience standpoint. So some shoes will have those extra metrics we attach to them to help with kind of that experience and also biomechanical purpose of them, you could say. And then, Jen, do you want to talk Elite or should I take a stab at it?
Keep going.
Cool. Yeah. So Elite, that's really where metabolics from that physiology side comes into play for sure. And then a really other key part that the team there is kind of looking into is a lot with like the joint level energetics. And so, looking at just work metrics of the ankle joint, are we seeing how those are changing or things of that sort, but really trying to bring in that physiology aspect with the Elite product as well is definitely the key one.
So if I'm hearing that correctly, a lot for the recreational runner is you're focusing on biomechanical factors that are related to experience. So either geometries, for example, especially up at the forefoot, which can create or facilitate a really smooth ride with additional thoughts about going, all right, from a medical standpoint, knowing kind of what the common pathologies out there for this area, what can we do to facilitate motion there for those who either might have it, or if not, create an experience that is comfortable. Obviously makes them want to keep running in the shoe, because one of the biggest predictors of footwear people want to use is for comfort. So how do we create that in that experience? Whereas the Elite is you're looking more at the energetics, the efficiency, especially at joint level, going, how can we make them more efficient, especially for faster and longer efforts, is kind of the big, not divide, but the differences in how you're focusing in these areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think a main underlying theme is support shows up through all of that. Like, we will never compromise yet on support. It's just what are the additional aspects we can quantify that you just talked about.
Got it. I will say off topic, I've been meaning to bring this up. Brooks Glycerin Max is awesome. I did not expect this, but this might be my shoe of the year. And even though the slightly short fit is giving me just a little bit of toe abrasion, I still have 102 miles on this as of this recording. So great job with that. When you're talking about the forefoot, I'm like, you are doing a great job. You two are doing a great job on this. It's been really, really, really good.
Yeah. The team did really well with that one.
So can we expand a little bit into that experience in terms of the development for the recreational runner and where kind of the big focuses are, whether from, if we want to go down the biomechanics standpoint, or if we want to dive into the habitual motion path right now. And I know that we throw this term around, and we, especially in Doctors Running, throw this term around and may not have defined it as well as we probably should have. So is that where you think we should go now? Is that worth diving into?
Dive into habitual motion, or like some of the distinction between the two?
Yeah. Where do you think we should go first?
Ooh.
We try to give options.
Yeah, we can. Maybe I'll add just a little bit more on like the Elite and the rec, and then maybe we can. Evan can go into some bit about where we're really expanding the habitual motion. I'd say once I would have added in the point of building for the elite compared to maybe building for the rec is to really put that runner at the center of the build. So we engage with such a high volume of runners in every shoe that we're building, and their needs are just different. So you can't just take one. Let's say you take the elite and you can't just tear it down, whatever. Take a takedown of that and say that's going to go. So we have a researcher on the team who did a really great project, just actually diving in really deep with these categories, especially when you're talking about race day or speed oriented products, something maybe for more that marathon space. And between the two groups, you have the same wants. They all want lightweight, responsive, and fit. Those are like the top three prioritized aspects of the shoe that they would talk about. But how they ranked within those three, there was still like stark differences. Like in the athlete space, it was like responsiveness, hands down, number one. 90% of people want that. That's going to be there. And then you go into lightweight as your next one, which is still like a pretty good step change down and rank second. And then fit is third. And it's like a pretty, separate third. So they had really big differences in like what they want. And the rec runner was like responsiveness is pretty much even with lightweight and fit. Like I want all three and I need all three. It wasn't like that responsiveness is going to come. And if you could also please get me those next two, it'd be great. It was like, no, I want all three. So get me all three and make sure they show up in a way that can last for me for durability. That's also like the fifth ranked one for the rec is durability. And that doesn't come up with like the elite space at all. It's like, I want the shoe to last. I don't want it to just be my one and done. I can't just keep going and buying like these $200 shoes all the time. And then support, as everyone's talking about support, like that's the fourth ranked highest attribute and need for the rec runner. And it's not that an elite doesn't want it, but it's not the forefront. It comes like way lower in the list of items, like of where they think about that as much. Whereas like that rec runner, it's like really in their headspace all the time of how to make sure they're supported throughout it. So just how you then prioritize what you're building into that shoe, where you would cut weight in an upper and maybe sacrifice a little bit of fit for like an advantage in lightweight. You're not going to do that on the rec runner. Like you want that fit to not have that sacrifice for them to have the comfort and everything that goes through. And just knowing where you're going to pull those dials a little bit. That was the only bit I was going to add about the difference between building for the two.
That's really interesting that the elites would have a much larger spread of relatively of priorities compared to the recreational running wanting the whole package. Like all of these things, what I'm hearing is all these things are important. So you have to be able to really balance those out. And it sounds like that actually might be a little bit more challenging in my mind to create something that balances all those, because you could make something responsive, you could make it light, but that some of that gets sacrificed in terms of comfort and stability and certain things if you try to get those too far down. Exactly. So that feels like that might be more challenging. Now, what happens with a shoe like the Hyperion Max 2, where it's something that kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, seems to be like kind of balancing. Yes, it's a faster shoe, but it's trying to balance between the elite and recreational runner. Is that a good way of categorizing that shoe? And is that same concept there, or is there a different view? Is that still part of the elite footwear concept behind that?
Yeah, I would say that you're spot on with that. But it does tread. You get a little, that shoe can sometimes pick its camp. Like it leans a little heavy into athlete, or it can lean a little heavy rec. And it's like a really hard one to also balance to make sure you're hitting kind of a sweet spot without like maybe still letting lightweight be a key priority to pull out a little bit more. But it's trying to balance in between the two worlds a little bit more to hit that consumer use.
And I will say, Evan, go for it.
I was going to add on a little bit there too. Kind of examples of, the next version of that shoe, some fun things we were doing for testing. Think of more like athletes around maybe our ability, call like 32 to 35 minute 10Ks. We're like making sure we're getting them as well. So we could obviously have it with the Beasts and the Hansons. We get kind of that spread, but then we're also still sending that shoe out to people that are running down the spectrum of speeds also. And that's really that one where we're intently gathering feedback from all the layers, you could say.
So that must be one of the more challenging one, to balance the greater spread versus we want all these things together. So I will say my comment, and I will not pretend to be an expert on this. This is just for me hanging around from really smart people like the two of you and getting to hear For those listening, this is extremely hard to do. This doesn't just happen after a single round of wear testing. This could take years and years and years of development, which is why I always laugh when I'm talking to anyone in the footwear industry and I'm like mentioning some shoe and like, oh yeah, that just came out, huh? I haven't heard of that shoe for like 3 years. And like, oh yeah, it takes a long time. So there's a lot that goes into this. So kudos to both of you that it's not a one and done process. This takes lots and lots and lots of rounds of testing and feedback to get where you want to be. Mm-hmm. So kudos on that.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, we mentioned the habitual motion path. So how has that, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but how has your understanding and application of the habitual motion path changed? So Evan, you were talking a little bit about the idea of like creating support in all the footwear. What does that mean now for Brooks compared to what it used to?
Yeah.
If it's different.
Yep. Yeah. Since a year and a half since we last talked, it's definitely pushed a lot in what we've been doing with it. So last time we were on and we were talking about the habitual motion path, at the time, the real focus was on quantifying the presence of a deviation. And that's just how differently your body moves when running compared to, I'd say, daily normal movements. We just used one movement to quantify someone's habitual motion path, which was a shallow squat. And we would say, okay, that is basically mimicking sitting down in a chair. And it's also, 50% body weight because you have two legs on the ground and a little bit just of a quote lighter load task. People can't see me air quote on audio, but we'll get it.
For those who are listening, yeah. Evan is air quoting just to clarify.
Lighter load. Yeah. Lighter load. But then we also only quantified a deviation at one time point during the movement, which was at maximum knee flexion. So what you basically do is, for quick riff off of the math, would say you go down, you have your knee flexion, and then you have your maximum knee flexion from your run, and say that's at 20 degrees. And you say like, okay, at 20 degrees, if I'm 5 degrees internally rotated at my knee, but I was 10 degrees internally rotated at my squat, then that's a 5-degree deviation. And you just kind of do a math of that sort. And we do that with internal rotation, which is just the twisting at the knee joint, and then ABA deduction, or kind of that knocking in, knocking out, and then eversion, or just that pronation or rolling inward at the ankle. And then are the three we look at. What we've done to advance the habitual motion path is we really looked at one movement as a limitation and then one time point as a limitation. So phenomenal starting ground of just like being able to establish this. And we did have some good studies showcasing like, hey, there is some merit here, such as like the Vilvacher study where we're looking at cartilage volumes before and after a run. And so that people that did deviate more had more cartilage compression, which we saw as a proxy for knee joint loading. But we still think we can push it further. So what we've done is we added more habitual movements. So we still keep the squat. We also then just added walking into it. We have people walk downstairs, and then we also have them do, we call it kind of like a shallow lunge, but it basically like mimics picking something up off the ground. But our thinking with these movements were, what are movements that people just do day in, day out? And that means your body's very like used to them. It's very habitual. But then they also provide more range of motion, at least in the sagittal plane, than running. So you can do the comparisons that you need to when it comes to looking at how different joint angles are matching up. So that was one key part of it. And then the second part of it was now using the entire stance phase to quantify a deviation. So instead of just that one time point, we use basically the entire stance. So from heel contact to toe off in this each joint angle. To go super, super math in depth, we use what's called a kernel density plot. But think of them as like fun little like manta rays or Rorschach figures. And depending on how much those overlap or not is our deviation. And that has really allowed us to have just more information about the movement, you could say, which has been really beneficial. And we published that method out earlier this year, which is a really exciting milestone for us to showcase pushing that forward. And then backing up, the key second part of the whole standards is we also do what we call weighting it. So the first habitual motion path deviation method was all kinematic based or just motion. Now we use the vertical ground reaction force, basically a measure of how hard you're hitting the ground hits you back, and to say like weight the deviation. And so joint angles that are happening at higher forces get just quote like weighted a little bit more, or they basically mean more. And we did that because we think of it as there's just more load going through the body at that point. And so if there's a deviation when there's more load, it probably means more from like an injury standpoint, you could say. So that was the key advancements that I'll say are out there right now from like public knowledge. And then we have a couple more that we've been doing internally that we presented out at ASB, which is American Society of Biomechanics, which was looking at that whole stance phase and now breaking it down into phases. So what was interesting was with the whole stance phase, while we get a lot of really good information, we found ourselves having to kind of be like, okay, we have this deviation, but when is it happening? Because the first method, you knew when that deviation was being quantified, but now it's kind of like, well, is it the first part of stance? Is it push off? Is it mid stance? When are these differences in movement occurring? And so shout out to my coworker, Rebecca Pallone, who coded up basically how to do this, brought her the idea, and she ran with it. And so what we do now is we break the stance phase into just like equal 20% buckets. And we did 20% because those phases do roughly correlate with some gait events of the foot. So from 0 to 20% is usually like heel contact to foot flat. Foot usually stays flat from about 20 to 60%. And then at 60% roughly for the average person is when the heels comes off the ground. And then 60 to 80, your heels generally off the ground. We had to keep equal sized buckets for, I'll say, math purposes, basically. But what it's really allowed us to do is get really more granular information in the product testing itself. So for instance, like we've had some shoes where the entire stance phase deviation looks good, but then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, we're actually better in the first part of stance, but then we're worse in push off. So we're still learning of like, where do we need to go in and really optimize geometries of shoes based upon basically how that support is coming through all the way from the heel to the toe.
My brain needs to process that for a second. I have so many questions. That's awesome. So you are now, well, beforehand, correct me if I'm wrong, you were looking at kind of that's not the right way to say this. You were looking at kinematics, but what you've been able to do now is separate this to go, what's actually happening at each part of the gait cycle, and hopefully being able, or of the stance phase specifically. And for those who don't know, stance means when your foot is on the ground. That is what we're talking about. When it lifts off and you're swinging through the air, that's called swing phase. So you're able to look at and essentially look biomechanically at comfort factors, habitual movement pathways, looking at what happens right as you land. So that initial contact loading response, what happens as you transition the body over that and you're moving into that mid stance phase, what happens as you get into that terminal stance, like pre-swing where the foot's coming off. So you're able to like pinpoint exactly what's happening at each one of those and compare, is this actually comfortable at each one of these points?
Yep.
That sounds like a lot of data to process.
It's a lot because now we have more metrics that come into the discussion of, when we go to pass or fail a shoe or things of that sort. But it's good because it takes guesswork out of things and just really allows us to hone in on the effect of different geometries in the shoe and kind of seeing that direct influence they have on the human biomechanics.
And I don't know if you can answer this question, so if we can cut this out if we need, are there any shoes that are on the market currently where this newer concept has been applied or not? Not yet.
I'm trying to remember if the Glycerin Max had it. I know that
you did a pretty good job with this. So that's why I was like, I wonder if Glycerin Max, did that get that treatment?
I think spring 25. How about this? With the updated method of like using the whole stance phase.
Yeah.
Yes, those products are.
Yeah.
The phase analysis, I think, is coming S25 products. So coming up here soon.
Sweet. This is another way to get hyped about those products. So now I'm even more excited. So this is great.
Yeah.
Jen, is there anything else that you would add on?
Yeah, I think for where we're going, even next steps with it, those are some of the very tangible methods we're doing now in-house with all of our product creation cycles, is generally also understanding how so habitual motion is the core of all what we believe kinematically. So everyone has a way they move. And if you can keep them closer to that movement, they will ultimately have better performance on the run and less aches and pains. So you'll reduce energetic cost, and then you'll reduce joint loads, which can lead to injury. So that's our ultimate goal. But understanding that there's different ways that people have this habitual motion. So like these clusterings of habitual motion, whether you're somebody that has a lot of rigidity in your habitual motion, and it's just the way that your body is, either from the laxity of your joints or past injuries or anything else, and that's where your comfort is. And those that are really flexible, and you can't just build the same way for these people. So if you're trying to have options in your line for keeping people close to these habitual motions, but there's different types of habitual motions, and you need to create the options in your actual product line. So we went through phases with, this Max Cush, and does our glycerin become the glycerin Max originally was like, is it just gonna be the glycerin? Now you're gonna take this shoe that's fairly flexible in a glycerin and completely remove all that flexibility by the time you'd make it what is now the Max. And it was this internal tension point of like what to do, of whether you make a whole nother shoe and let the glycerin stay and be what it is, or you absorb it, because, max cushion is what the glycerin is supposed to be anyways. And we decided to keep them separate because we thought you're going to alienate a lot of people's biomechanics and how people move if you just make everything big. But you want to have the big cush max rocker option for those that this really is an optimal space for them. So it's this balance of how many shoe options you make, to balance out how many habitual motions we believe are out there and how many different clusters of movement patterns are natural for people. And that's where you want to let them have that breathing room. And then I'd say we're also evolving a lot of, you're kind of limited what you can collect in-house. To have someone come in and run a test with us, it's like a 2.5 hour process. They run in 6 shoes. You really get maybe 5 minutes in each shoe. So it's still like a pretty short window to get an idea of how the shoe's impacting how you move. And so we've done a lot more long runs in-house, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, where people naturally self-initiate fatigue. They'll say that they're fatigued and done, to see what happens from the start all the way to the end of your run. So there's also a lot in how we're evolving. Like we used to talk about that you're either a high deviator or a low deviator. You're somebody who stays close to your habitual motion. Or you're someone that isn't. You're someone that needs support, or you're someone that isn't. That's like still even what's currently, if you went through our gear finder, that's how it's set up. But we know that from how many runners we've had in, everybody needs support. It still can come up in a gradual level, but we believe that support is in everything. It's not an absence of it. And how to get at that foundational level of support and product and help guide people still to either what one shoe is best for them, or for some it will be multiple, depending on whether you run flat road all the time or if you're running hills. If you're running up and down hills, you're running different paces. You have a variety of run types. Your mechanics will be different with each of those environments. And you can match product better to those environments to support you optimally in each one of those. Or if you're like me, I run the same run over and over. So I can live with one type of shoe probably if I didn't want a different experience, but my mechanics are satisfied in one genre of construction. So those are also evolutions, I'd say, in the thinking of who needs support. And we think it's everybody. And how does support show up? It needs to show up in different constructs. It can't be max cush for everyone. Because of knowing that people have these different habitual motions that we can cluster.
And so when you say support, so I have two questions. One should be hopefully not too bad. The other one might be a little rough, so bear with me, because I've also been trying to figure it out too. When you say support, you're meaning in reference to the habitual motion pathway, not this exactly has to have a medial post. We're moving away from that, going, can we create footwear that facilitates your normal motion? And that may or may not involve a post, a guide rail, all that kind of stuff. But we have a lot more options now to do that. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yep.
Got it. So the follow-up question, this has been asked for years. Do you think run categories are going to move away from the neutral stability categories? And do you think it's going to be a different blend? Or if you had to organize a shoe wall, how would you two organize it?
Yeah.
I did warn you to, sorry.
So there's a bit, obviously, of like the trade and the biomechanics. So I'll only speak to biomechanics. I won't speak to the trade part of it. Biomechanically, we believe that it should be like support for all. Support is in everything that we're building. There isn't like this option of no support, which is what a neutral is thought of from that sense. And then how support shows up for you would be a combination of understanding how you move in that habitual space, where you're moving. So again, if you're doing hills, flat, paces or not, and then experientially just what you want to feel underfoot. And for some people, maybe one shoe is like, you got to live in this one space. And some might be, here's your quiver. Here's like 4 that'll work really well for you because of the variety of run and how it shows up. So we would organize, I think, more by brand, which in when North America is a bit more common to see it by brand. That's not globally such the case, but if we were staying within our own shoe wall, I think we'd organize it more by these different ways support shows up. But support is in all of them. That's not part of the conversation. It's not whether you need support or not. It's what type of support is going to maximize your run.
Evan, anything to add or any different thoughts?
No, I think Jen did it really well. Yeah, it's a combination of, just biomechanically what you need, but I do think the environment is such a big factor there. We've had a couple researchers internally, Eddie Martinez and Kaylee Dio, that have been doing some like graded running studies and looking at support across shoes and uncovering some findings that way. Megan Saftich internally from the team looking at like support at different speeds. And we're finding really intriguing results to roll into products. And that's just the biomechanics lens. But then from the environment side, I'll actually quote you guys. I think it was David was on one of them, and they were talking about like the half marathons that go like way uphill. And he said himself, he's like, big cushioned rocker shoe is kind of sluggish uphill. And we're like, well, if you have to fight that, that's not supportive, right? And so what those behaviors are and where you're running is such a influence on what shoe will work well for you. It is, everything needs support. It's just based on, call it different movement groups that we can bucket you in, but then also what are just different types of support texts or geometries that work for different environments.
And so, Jen, you represent there's going to be a variety of responses to this. There are some people that can only live in one level, and that's just who they are or what they have the greatest success with, and that's great. There's other people that can have a quiver, and when you say a quiver, is that both that they can handle a variety of things, or is it they are able to adjust? I don't know how to answer this question. I don't know. My brain is not working. Do you see where I'm going with this?
I think maybe I'll ramble and I'll see if it lands well. I think it will be a bit of both in those. So like, I think that there will be people that you have either pain-free movement for you shows up in one or limited way. Like my poor husband, I always use him as the example, but he has OA in his toes. And so like really flexing of the toes is not an option for him. And the maxes. So like I'm sure when we were even on the call last time, we didn't have the Ghost Max yet. And he was having to wear balance. And I was like, no, I at least work there. So like, I don't feel as bad about it. But how do we not have something that you can use? And then we put the Ghost Max out. I was like, finally. So now he just has like 8 pairs of Ghost Max. So he'll wear that one. But that he'll be limited in what he can use, but he's very active. He's a very active person. He just has pain. And if he has, if he's not in this very limited motion space that works for him. Right, Kitty? Yeah. So that's where he'll live. Others, I think if you do not have predisposed injury or something that like limits in general where you do or do not feel pain, then that will open you up automatically. And then also just your variety of runs. There's people, again, who run uphill, downhill, fast-paced, slow-paced, and to really hit each of those environments optimally, you would have product that works great for you. And as long as you can do it pain-free, then we'll have the construction. And then you're ones again like me that run the same route and I like run flat, then I probably don't need the quiver. I might like how it feels, but biomechanically I'm moving in a pretty similar way the whole time.
I like that. I like also, yes, some people might just be able to live in this certain area. Some people are either adaptable or they want those different experiences. So that's why the Brooks line is designed to be able, what are these experiences? What are these levels of support that we can provide? And can we get a complete or as close as possible to a complete spectrum that we think is going to be able to match the needs of a variety of runners? Or as Evan, I don't remember his gender, I think Evan, you said that like there are certain kind of camps or categories that certain people might fit into. And so can we get better at identifying those so we can actually design footwear around those individual needs, which is probably pretty hard because humans are pretty variable and like to like not fit in boxes half the time. So I'm very impressed that trying to quantify this. It's really frustrating sometimes.
Current job.
Yeah. You live in a balance all the time of trying to simplify. You want to make it as simple as possible. Like we internally went through again this dialogue of like, does Max become everything? That's your whole thing. We'll just make Max shoes, and that is support. Because if you make 5 different types of supports, it's too confusing. How are you going to explain it? How are you going to help people get to the one that's best for them? So if it's one, it's really easy. I was like, well, yeah, it's easy to explain. Then it's one. So like if it's not the one that's good for you, you have no other options. But that's this like really difficult balance we keep living in of like how many options to make. How can you explain it to people? How do you make it approachable when it's, especially if it's in a space where you're not going to have someone who can explain it to you? It's on a wall in a location that doesn't have a person explaining the product line to you. So that's reality of selling product and how to find that balance.
Or it's online or it's in other areas. Yeah. So trying to figure out, okay, so you're trying to go beyond obviously just trying to make a shoe, but it's how do we create experience, but also how do we educate people on figuring out what's going to be optimal to them? We're not just trying to sell them a shoe. We're trying to create an experience. And as we've talked before, it's, you don't want to injure people. You want to keep people healthy and help them figure out what they might actually need or work better with.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy task. It's usually a longer learning experience sometimes.
Definitely.
Sweet.
100%.
Evan, is there anything you would add on to that in terms of the like what you're seeing in terms of how do you understand who fits in what, like the educational component of helping people figure that out? Or is that
oh man, that's a really good question. Something I'd say like we're actively working on regarding quantification tools in the wild per se, or just out for an everyday consumer. I do think right now the way I'd answer it is, if you put a shoe on and it feels supportive in a way that like you define support. So some people may, for example, like they like a guide rail because they like a firmer feeling under their foot. Some people may look at that Glycerin Max and say, this is support because it's just a ton of cushion. Some people like that upper really locking them down as their key definition of support. And so however, as an individual, you define support kind of yourself, like that's one way to do it. And then the other way is, well, it's an and, not an or.
Yeah.
But another way to really think about support coming through is like, does it feel like it works for you? So if there's anything on the shoe, like say you land and you feel it push you inward, it's probably not going to be something great. You want that shoe to feel like it's really just meshing with your foot. And that's really where like that comfort filter concept comes into play. For sure, is it work with your body heel to toe and feel supportive in a way that you like.
This is why I love you too and having you on, because you have now completely forced my brain to rethink my definition of support. So thank you. Because what I used as my high horse, I was like, or my soapbox, like, okay, support is not equal to cushion. It's defined by the like rigidity or resistance or facilitation of forward motion and resisting frontal plane motion. And now I'm realizing that definition is completely wrong. And you both have given me multiple answers about how that's wrong. And the term support is far more encompassing than I really gave it credit for. So I can't be like, oh, cushioning doesn't mean support, when in fact, actually, as we're talking about going uphill or how the foam compresses underfoot and facilitates motion is totally a form of support. How the upper contacts the foot and holds the foot on the platform is totally a form of support. And I have to get better at also talking about this and not being so like, it's only this. And so I appreciate that. And also gives me more respect for going how many different ways you can talk about support and what that probably means to the runner instead of telling them, no, you're wrong. It's this. It's like, oh, wait, how are you defining this?
A lot of different ways.
Lots. Yep.
So is that, you both have probably been defining it like that for a long time. When did you have that switch recently, or has that been a longer like thought process you had to go, yeah, no, support is this multifactorial thing that's not just the old way, which is, I will admit that I'm defining it as is like, is there a post? Is there a sidewall? Is there rigidity side to side? I'm assuming you two have been thinking about this, not that way for a while. Or
yeah, I mean, I would say that not that way in a while, in the sense that even, for example, like a ghost, which has been defined in this neutral, air quoting and joining the air quote land, this neutral space product. We test that shoe every time we build it in-house still with runners coming in and seeing if it's keeping you close to your habitual motion. So in general, for us, always, we know that biomechanically support needs to show up in every single shoe that we build, whether it's getting categorized as a neutral shoe or sport shoe in the current paradigm of how the trade works. So that has always been there in the 7-8 years that I've been at Brooks in terms of that awareness of support. In terms of like really talking in this holistic space, that's also been there, I'd say, the whole time I've been at Brooks, in the sense of we have like 8 biomechanical influencers we'll talk about, and is the tooling and the top. So everything underfoot and everything on top of your foot, and how that is getting your body through the stride, basically, and keeping it as close as it can. But again, like by the time you have to go consumer facing with some of that, it's just too complicated. If you're not going to break out 8 different types of support in your upper combined with 10 different types of support in your tooling, and then, or which one is your best combo? Like those get real difficult to make these bespoke solutions. So there's a balance still in how much you're communicating outwardly and what you're building behind the scenes in terms of hurting people's brains when trying to.
So do I not need to, or not need to go rewrite all the stability sections for Dior I've been writing the last couple of years?
Well, stability or support?
That's fair.
Because I would say those are 2 different terms. And
that's fair. We might
shout
need
out to Eddie Martinez for having many conversations about that with me.
Got it. Could you elaborate on that for the listener and viewer?
Yeah, I think support is, this is my personal opinion. Support is kind of what I was mentioning earlier. Like you can have your own personal definitions of maybe what you're looking for. But then I would say through the lens of the habitual motion path solving, that's support, because it's not a directional response with the habitual motion path. Like you may need to be like freed up, which is not what traditional support is. Whereas I would say stability is the classic, like lock the foot up, like increase bending stiffness, increase torsional stiffness, firm things up, and just like a stable structure. Think of like a pyramid. The more you add, the wider it gets, the more stable that thing is. And I'd say it's more directional response in that way. You could think of like add more, make it stiffer, more stable.
Got it.
But that's not what everyone needs for an optimal support.
Yeah. And so we need to move away. This has been known in the research world and your world for a long time, but we need to continue to move away from mixing support and stability. Stability is its own piece, correct me if I'm wrong, of support. Some people need a ton, some people need little to none. But the concept of support is it's the habitual motion pathway. How do we facilitate your motion in the most comfortable way that works for you? But that is not equal to stability. These are 2 separate components. So because I labeled it the stability section, I don't have to go rewrite like years of this. Great.
Saving you some work.
Sweet. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Find the loopholes.
Loopholes. Appreciate it. I will still approach this differently going, how am I defining this? So I appreciate you taking me along for that journey. So last kind of big section question I wanted to talk to you both about, and I know this now as I've finally finished my PhD and I'm now in a lab, biomechanics lab, trying to flounder my way through it. So I might come calling you crying, as I usually have during the PhD, now afterwards, going, how do you do this? So when you test people in lab, there are great things you can find. Like you can hook people up to all the wonderful cameras and the expensive treadmills and all this stuff and get this great kinetic and kinematic data. But And you're able to get people out of the world and come in for an hour, which is awesome. Because you can get a better idea of what fatigue looks like. But you've also been talking about testing runners in the real world, because what they do on the treadmill does not always correlate to what happens in the real world. So you can give us a little view into what testing runners in the real world means and how that's evolved your understanding of footwear development.
Yeah, definitely. We just gave a tour a couple weeks ago, some folks coming in, and they were asking us about the equipment. We have 3 motion capture bays set up in the lab. And it was all about like, oh, what are the advancements in this technology that you're using in the lab? And we kind of looked up and we were like, we're actually not advancing in here. These are real good. These they got it in check. We're trying to get out of here. That's where we're trying to advance, is to leave this room. Not leave that room behind. It is the end. Like, you learn a lot in that room. But to still,
I was going to say, if you don't want any of that stuff, I will happily take anything. As I was drooling when I came up there going, you have all this? Yeah,
understanding what we could get in this very accurate space of motion capture. But it is a very tiny, tiny glimpse into what that runner is experiencing. So one, I mean, like, you can get into the debates about treadmill and overground running. Let's just say, for the sake of it, treadmill's accurate enough, then you would still get at, like, this is a very short moment of time that you are in this room with us, running for us. And when you look at people's watch metrics of these variety of runs, people run a massive variety. You're going uphill, downhill some days, totally flat others, this pace, that pace, total distances. Like, it's just not even remote. Like, if you had to find one dot out of the 70 dots that are a run for somebody that would even remotely reflect what you saw in the lab, it would be one out of those 70. So, like, you're really not getting a holistic understanding of what that person is dealing with, or not dealing with sounds negative, is experiencing out in their world. So we really want to invest in wearable technology that lets us understand them in their environment, so that you can really cater to understanding what's unique to them or a cluster like them, so that you can make better recommendations and inform them with education on the product that would optimize their experience ultimately. Whether that's watch, we still lean into the watch with our partnership with Dash and what we can understand from your run environment, more so in your literal environment, like pace and distance, and then some weather aspects and things you deal with there. The movement mechanics are not very accurately captured within a watch, so more IMUs, and where we bring that wearable tech out to understand, again, the variety that you're running in and how your support needs will change depending on that environment that you're in that day. So that's really where we're pushing, is how we get out into their domain with them. And we already do that in a perception-based, all of our surveys. I mean, you hear a lot more from the runner. They get the shoe for 6 weeks. They do tell us the different types of runs they use the product in and what worked and what didn't work for them. So you're at least getting that via their words, which mean a lot. And you can learn a lot from that as a starting base. But being able to capture what they don't know, like, they can't describe their movement mechanics. They don't know what is happening to their body the entire time they're out there. That's what we want to keep pushing.
That's awesome. For those the listeners and viewers that don't know, can you define what an IMU is?
An inertial measurement unit. It's a little device you can slap on your shoe, and then you can get a better feeling for how much your ankle is moving and rolling, to give us proxy to some of the more very specific measurements you get from a motion capture camera.
Sweet. There's become more frequently used in some areas of research, just to be able to capture that real world stuff, because then you don't have to follow them around with the camera system, which kind of looks awkward when they're running around town. I'm just kidding. Yeah. So what other metrics are you looking at that might help you define, or not define, but get a better picture of how people are responding to footwear? And then I guess the follow-up question is, what are you doing with it?
Where we're expanding a lot, besides getting out. So getting out with the runner in the wild is our biggest kind of movement mechanic initiative. So where we want to understand what you look like and how it relates to the habitual motion. That's very kind of outward motion facing. We're advancing physiology. So we've never had physiology directly in our scope of research at Brooks. We would do energetic cost in terms of the elite product, but it was very narrow. Like, that's one little teeny piece of the pie that we were trying to understand in terms of what impact movement has on the body and how that will influence your performance and your injury at the end of the day. And specifically, we're focusing a lot more on muscle damage, what you can understand from salivary biomarkers and how your environment and the product is influencing muscle damage, and then thermal regulation. And then particularly for us more now, talking about hot, how you deal with hot. We'll maybe eventually get to how you deal in cold. But as a first entry point, bringing physio into our space was really beating the heat, and how you do that with product, how you do that with education in terms of hydration. We have an amazing physiologist, Bridget, who joined our team, and she can measure your sweat and tell you all what you need to do in terms of hydration to optimize your regulation, thermal regulation there as well. So that's a really big area for us at Advance in the last 6 months. That's brand new for our domain of research. And then we're really trying to unlock a lot more of the mind. We started to talk about this a little bit, I think last time, a year and a half ago, where we knew we wanted to do it, but we hadn't done it yet, but we wanted to do it, but we hadn't done it yet. And it was still kind of sitting in this cycle. And we've actually started to do it. So we've been in the last 6 months really trying to tap into what the mind is experiencing, how the mind is influencing the body out on the run as well. There's really exciting stuff. We're learning more about the runner and what they're facing and what could get them, again, ultimately to maximize their performance and minimize injury risk, and how the mind will influence all of that, not just what I can capture from your kinematics.
That's so cool. There's a lot of research coming out right now on how beliefs and especially kinesiophobia can make very either acute or chronic changes in someone's movement pattern. So that is really exciting. And at some point, I would love to pick your brain on what you two are finding with that. Because I think it's very exciting that that's the next frontier going, how are people thinking and how does that influence their decision making and even their movement patterns, which I don't think we have a full understanding of yet, which is really cool to think about.
For sure.
Sweet. Yeah, we have some work we'll be sharing out at, hopefully we just submitted it to ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine, for next year. And there are 2 mind-based explorations and how the mood state and mind state have influenced movement mechanics, your rate of perceived exertion, basically when you just kind of call it on a run, and then generally the behavioral mindsets that people have for those that are experiencing more positive mood state compared to those that are dealing with more challenges. So there's some really exciting pieces hopefully coming out early next year on that as well.
Sweet. So we're not getting into you're designing your footwear based on if you're happy, sad, or anything no, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. So okay. So that was meant as a joke.
We want you that if you get that shoe, it puts you into that positive mind space. And that positive mind space will make a difference on your run. So that is we are not turning any domain off. It'll be product build, mood and psychology. There's a lot of aspects in the mind that can come through.
That totally blows my mind, because when you both talk about, especially Evan talking about the run experience, I don't think I had thought about that beyond biomechanics and understanding what that experience means both emotionally and psychologically for a human being is really cool. So I have to go process all of this. That was a lot. So Jen, Jennifer, I just combined your names. Jennifer, Evan.
I like that.
Yeah, my brain is going 1,000 miles a minute, which is why I love having you two on. And I will probably need a month plus to go process everything we've talked about. As always, we appreciate you two coming on. And we also appreciate everybody that's watching and listening with all the stuff that we get to talk about. It is individuals like this that make this so exciting to continue learning and talking with people in the industry and out, going, what can we learn and how can that help us not only understand how footwear is being developed, but also how we can make better decisions about what we're putting on our feet. You can find, is there good places to find you two, or should we, I don't know where I'm going with this.
I was like, LinkedIn. Physically find us?
Yeah, no, not physically. They're both up at Brooks. They're doing phenomenal work up there. If there's any additional questions that you have, we can definitely send it to those two and see if they're willing to respond. Of course, obviously, I'm going to get them on again and keep bothering them until we do, because now there's thousands of other podcasts we probably need to do to answer all the questions that I have right now. As always, you can find us on a variety of different sites, whether you're listening to us on Spotify, iTunes, or you're watching us visually on YouTube or some of the other areas. There's lots of different places to consume what we try to put out to help you make better decisions on the footwear. There's obviously the many different social sites, including Instagram, and then and LinkedIn and all those stuff. And then also the website, which is the original start to a lot of the content that we put out. Always, I know I say this 1,000 times, we hope this helps you put better stuff on your feet and figure out what works for you. And Evan and Jen, I really appreciate you both being on here. I do have one last question for you two. And so I did not tell either of them, for the listeners and watchers, I didn't tell them this, but what is your favorite Brooks shoe? And if it was a pizza, what pizza would it be?
I was like, I know, as you started to say this, I was like, I think you stressed me out last time when you asked some like bonus question at the end of my
Hey, at least it was like the OG days where somebody's like, Matt, what if this shoe was a sport, like this NBA sports team, what would it be? I'm like, can I just say Blazers or Lakers for everything? This is the two major cities I've lived in. Like, can you give me a break?
Maybe this won't be my favorite. I'm going to change from favorite, but like surprised how much I like it, because I'm not a Max Cush person. I've always like the Levitate was my shoe, and I miss Levitate. So but I'm really pleasantly surprised with the Glycerin Max as someone that is not my domain, that it's just very, I use it more for walk as opposed to run per se for me, but I kind of, as it was coming out, I was like, that's not my user space. But I still always get a pair of something that's coming out on the market, so I don't forget, because you are 2 years ahead all the time. So it's a good pulse point for me to remember like what we're making right now. And I've been wearing those babies around, and I was like, man, these are actually pretty comfortable. So I'm just kind of intrigued, surprised, because it's, again, not usually where I live in my preferences. But the pizza, I would probably say like meat lovers, and more not to offend anybody who doesn't like meat, but it's kind of like, it's a lot of a lot. So like when you get like a meat lover's pizza and you're just like slammed with like a salt coma because there's so much meat on there, it's like there's just so much chew, and yet it tastes so good. You still want another one. Maybe you don't need another one. I don't know. That's sort of like the moods I'm going through with my Glycerin Maxes that I've been wearing around. Super weird analogy. I don't know where I was taking that.
No, that's a great answer. This is exactly where this is supposed to go. All right, Evan, what do you think?
Oh man, my favorite. I'm a Ghost Max guy. I gotta go to, not only from just like the shoe itself, but the entire process that went into that shoe, of like internally to get it to market, all the testing we did, and every little bit we obsessed over that shoe. I love it, and I need it. So it's a pizza. So I was actually going to go like it's a Supreme. It has a lot, but it delivers. Jen kind of put that right in the Glycerin Max. So maybe it's just solid pepperoni. It's just, it does the trick. It's got a little bit of red onion there to make it a little bit unique and like, know you did it right. But it's a little pep with a little veg included, because it rounds everything out nice.
Those were great answers. As always, Jen Sumner, Evan Day, thank you two very much for being on here. And I will definitely looking forward to the next time that we all get to talk.
Thanks for having us. Always great chatting with you, Matt.